I think one of the biggest things that COVID did was to give contemporary parents a front row seat to what their children were and were not receiving. Some are really approaching it from a negative perspective in terms of, well, I want to protect my child from this, as opposed to the affirmative pursuit of something. But regardless of the impetus for the approach, I think one of the things that has happened is that parents have seen what the public education system has presented, and they realize, I don't want my child to go that route. And then others realize, because they were forced to because of COVID, I think I can do it. That was one of the major hurdles that many people had, that they didn't believe they could do anything about it. They now realize, no, I can teach my own child.
Welcome to Homeschool Talks, a podcast by HSLDA. This is a show about all things homeschooling, from practical tips to inspiring stories and everything in between. You can find show notes for this episode along with our other Homeschool Talks conversations at hslda.org/podcast. And if you want to be the first to know about new episodes, as well as upcoming guests and topics, sign up for our email list using the link in the show notes. We're so glad you've joined us today, and we hope you enjoyed the program. Here's your host, Jim Mason.
Hi, I'm Jim Mason, President of Homeschool Legal Defense Association, and this is another edition of Homeschool Talks, where I get to talk to interesting people about things that interest me in the homeschooling world. And I'm very excited today to introduce to you Abraham Hamilton III. He's the General Counsel for the American Family Association. He has a daily radio program on the AFR network called The Hamilton Corner, where he talks about current events from a biblical worldview. I first learned about Abraham a few months ago when our founder, Mike Ferris, called me and said, I just heard Abraham Hamilton speak at a conference. He was terrific. And I learned that he's a lifetime member of HSLDA. He has 6 kids ranging in age from 12 down to 2. And he and his wife, Maria, are homeschooling them all. And he's just on fire and passionate about homeschooling, and especially homeschooling from a Christian perspective. So Mike decided we should have this man on our board of directors, and that has come to pass. He's here in my office today visiting with our entire staff. We had a nice program lined up for him so that he could meet our different departments and the whole staff. And we're just very excited to have him here and to learn more about him. So welcome, Abraham.
Thank you very much. I am glad to be here.
Yes. And so we have learned a lot about you, and I think our listeners would really enjoy hearing your life story. How in the world did you decide to homeschool your kids?
Well, that's quite a question. What happened in my life, and ultimately my wife's life, we were together doing a course of study in biblical worldview. And there was a portion of that study that included a portion concerning the history of education globally, but with a particular focus on education in America. And our study led us to one of two conclusions, learning about people like Horace Mann and John Dewey and some of the things that has transpired that laid the foundation really for what we're living in currently, led us to the place where we either would have to send our children to private Christian school or we would have to homeschool them. And so when we got to that point of the conversation, I asked my wife, Maria, I said, babe, what do you think about us homeschooling our children when we have children? At that time, we didn't have any children. We were newlyweds. And she said, are you crazy? I don't think about homeschooling. There's nothing to think about in terms of homeschooling. And so I said, well, we just need to consider it, because what we're learning, these are the things that are happening, and considering the commands that God gives to Christian parents as to what is required of us concerning children, we have to really, really think about it. So we continue praying, continue thinking. And I did a little bit of research at the time. We were living in Houston, Texas. I was practicing at the Harris County District Attorney's Office, and I found an organization called the Texas Homeschool Coalition. I didn't know who they were, or what they did, but I found out that they had a convention that was not too far from where we lived. And so after speaking to a wonderful person on the phone, I said, well, how much does it cost to come to this thing, And she started giving me all the answers and the rates, but all of the rates included costs for families with children that varied depending on the size of your family. I said, well, how much does it cost if you don't have any children? And she said, you don't have any children? I said, well, no, we don't have any children yet. She said, well, you can come for free. And I said to the staff earlier, one of my favorite prices is free 99. So we went, and that homeschool convention, the Texas Homeschool Coalition's convention, solidified for us that was the direction that God was calling our family in. And at that time, we didn't have any children. Soon after that, we got pregnant with our first son, Christian, who's here. And we've homeschooled all of our children from the very beginning. And the major thing that the Lord convicted us about was discipleship. And the call for the disciple is to love the Lord with all our heart, soul, minds, and strength. Cultivation of our minds and our children's minds ultimately is intrinsic to our responsibility to disciple them. So that commitment led us to the only solution for us, which was to disciple them from our home, including their academic matriculation.
So you met your wife in Houston, but you were kind of blown to Houston from New Orleans by Hurricane Katrina.
Yes.
Tell us about your growing up years.
Yeah, that is literally the truth. I was born and raised in New Orleans, Louisiana. Unlike my children, I went to public school my entire life until high school. And because I could play basketball, I got a scholarship to a private Catholic school in New Orleans. But things fast forward a bit, I ended up going to law school ultimately in New Orleans at Loyola University College of Law. And at the very beginning of my third year of law school is when Hurricane Katrina hit. And so Hurricane Katrina thrust me literally westward from New Orleans to Houston, Texas, where I ultimately had to learn Texas law in 2 months, pass a bar exam, and I started practicing law in Houston, which is what led me to meet my wife in the Harris County District Attorney's Office.
So you met your wife in Houston. Tell us about how you met.
Yes. So as I mentioned, I was an assistant district attorney in the Harris County District Attorney's Office. And at the time when I met my wife, then I didn't know it was going to be my wife. I was assigned to the Family Criminal Law Division. And that was a particular division that the sitting elected district attorney had made the decision to prosecute domestic violence cases, but in the specific circumstances where you had a victim who would recant an initial complaint of domestic abuse. And the reasoning behind that was sociological research concerning what's called the cycle of violence. And the basic methodology and theory behind it was if we can intercept and interrupt an alleged offender, that we could prohibit potentially that metastasizing penchant for violence that could ultimately culminate in homicide. So even recanting victim cases, the decision was made, we need to prosecute those cases. And so I had one of those cases that I was prepping for trial. But in this instance, being in Houston, Texas, the prevalence of the Spanish-speaking community there, the witnesses and the victim involved was a Spanish speaker. And so I'd had an assistant who helped me with translations at the time, because I'm not a native Spanish speaker, but I've learned a lot since I got married. But this particular day when I was doing this trial prep, my assistant wasn't there. And so I was told that, well, we have a new person started today, but they're in HR. And when she gets finished in HR, we'll bring her to your office. And I was sitting at my desk, typing away at my computer. I hear a knock at my door, but my door is never closed. So they're knocking to get my attention. And then when I turn around, my wife is standing in the door.
Did you know that immediately?
I did not know it right that moment, but it didn't take me very long.
Yeah.
You know, I said this at the National Leaders Conference, and I told this to my wife one time. I said, it doesn't take a whole day to recognize sunshine.
Yeah.
Especially if we've been walking in the dark for a while. So I'd known her after working with her for a little bit of time. I recognized there was something different about her. And it's a true story. I actually called my pastor back in New Orleans and told him I met a young lady. I said, there's something about her, you know? And so a year and a month from the day we met, Maria and I got married.
Wow.
Yep. That's the truth.
That's a real love story. So where Maria is a native Spanish speaker. Tell us about her background and where she comes from.
My wife was born and raised in Ponce, Puerto Rico. Her dad worked in the oil industry. And so he ended up moving from Puerto Rico to Texas, to Houston, to work in the oil industry, which resulted in my wife growing up a portion of her developmental years in Texas, went to college in Texas. And then ultimately she became employed at the DA's office as well, which is how our paths crossed. Took a storm to get me from New Orleans to Texas, and relocation economically for her family, which led to us meeting.
So there's two threads of your life that I really want to pursue. Your professional life, how you went from being a prosecutor in Houston, Texas, to becoming general counsel at AFA. And then you and your wife, Maria, had this strong conviction to homeschool even before you had kids.
Mm-hmm.
But now you are homeschooling. So a little bit more about that story. And you can pick which order you want to do it in.
Either one is fine with me. I guess I'll start with the general counsel story. So I was still prosecuting, and I had a friend of mine who, after Hurricane Katrina, we kind of lost contact for a while. His name was Will Addison, and the Lord just put him on my heart to call one day. And so it had been close to probably almost 10 years since I'd last spoken to him before Hurricane Katrina. And I didn't even know if his phone number still was the same or anything. And interestingly, when I called the only number I had for him in my cell phone, and he answered, and that first conversation, we talked for over 3 hours. And when we talked, this is just the truth. Most of what we talked about in that conversation was how the Lord had moved Maria and I to homeschool, and at that time, my friends, the Addisons, they're a homeschooling family now, but at the time they weren't. And he said to me, man, it's funny you said that. I feel like the Lord may be moving us in a similar direction. And that was the major part of our conversation at that juncture. Our conversation continued, and I said, we need to reconnect. I want to come and visit you. And because when the last we had spoken, I was not married yet, and he and his wife were newlyweds, and they hadn't had children yet. So I hadn't met his children. He hadn't met my wife or my children. And so, but we were friends, and we reconnected that relationship. But when I came to visit him, none of this was said before. So when I went to visit him at his house, he said, man, I work at American Family Association. I said, really? What's that? And he started telling me about it. And he explained to me that they have devotions every morning, staff-led devotions, but on Wednesdays, they allow outsiders to do devotions. And so he said, when you come, would you do devotions for us? And I said, oh, okay. Well, no, since you're here, would you do devotions for us? So yeah, I'll do devotions. Fine, no problem. And after doing the devotions, I was introduced to a man named Tim Wildman, who is the president of AFA, who I'd never met prior to that moment. And my first conversation with Tim is he said, we need you here. We need you here. We need you we need a new lawyer on our staff. And I was like, well, you're here to do what? I mean, I'm not trying to move. I'm not looking for a job. I'm not doing anything. He said, we need you here. And our conversation continued. And I can't remember if he said it or I said it, but it concluded with us saying at that moment, I need to talk to my wife about this. I'm not making this move without talking to her about this and let her know what's going on, what you're thinking. And then we need to pray as well. I need to talk to my wife and we need to pray. He said, you do that. Go back to New Orleans. You guys talk and you pray, but take my cell number and you call me when you're ready. What I did not know, God knew, but I did not know, behind the scenes, AFA's general counsel at that time had already provided notice that he was preparing to retire. And so they needed someone to replace him. And one of the major things that AFA was concerned about is someone that would have a biblical worldview. It's one thing to have, competent professional abilities. It's another thing to have a common worldview, and so it seemed that we were a good fit. And after meeting Tim Wildman, the general counsel came to me and said, listen, if you will agree to come, I'll stay. I'll delay my retirement another year so I could help train you to take my position. And so long story short, we prayed. My wife agreed with me that it was something that the Lord seemed to be directing us toward. And then here we are now. I'm general counsel at AFA now.
So your friend, Will, and his wife, Miki, have been guests on this podcast.
Really?
Yeah. So if anybody is interested in hearing from them, they also have a program.
Yes.
And I think in our archives, people can go and see that interview as well. Will's kind of a quiet guy in person, but boy, you get him on camera. Woo, he's got some words.
Yeah. Yes. And he's been the same way. Will and I have known each other since I was 14 years old. And he's been a consistent, godly man. At that time, godly young man. Yeah. But consistently throughout his lifetime. And
they had a kind of a background in campus ministry before they came to AFA.
That's right.
So AFA's got quite a large number of people with similar backgrounds and doing radio programs. I watched their program too for before I did that podcast, and I've seen Abraham's program, the Hamilton Corner, a couple of times. Tell us about what's the purpose of that and what do you do on that?
Yeah, the Hamilton Corner, my objective, and some days I feel like I do a better job than other days, but my objective there is to establish a biblical framework, a biblical grid, if you will, to navigate the issues of the day, and then to provide a mechanism for applying that biblical framework to the current issues of our time. And so that's the hope, that's the objective. And so every day, that's what we endeavor to do during the program.
Yeah, and it's an important perspective to have on the events of the day today, especially. So I asked you to pick, and you picked AFA first. Now, as you and Maria had started having kids and moved towards your homeschooling career, tell us how that's worked out for you guys.
It's worked out better than we could ever imagined. When we first started this journey, and I guess I should say the Addisons, I don't know if you know, they started a new program called Culture Proof. Yeah, They have a new podcast, and so that's available, so you can find that. But yeah, it's been phenomenal. My wife and I, we've been homeschooling now, I guess, 11 years. And our commitment from the very beginning was discipleship focused. It is one of the things that led us away from choosing the private Christian school route was most of the private schools that we found kind of had their curricula similar to the public schools and just added maybe a Bible course. And we didn't want to unintentionally communicate to our children that there was a bifurcation between knowledge, academic matriculation, and spiritual development. But we wanted them to understand that Christ is to be the foundation of all discipline, as Proverbs teaches, Proverbs 1:7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, and that isn't limited to any particular discipline, but he's the foundation of it all. So that is what led us to that. And so understanding the command, Ephesians 6:4, Paul's epistle to the Ephesians, 6 chapters, even though there's no chapter and verse demarcations in original manuscripts. The first half of the book in Greek is written in the indicative mood, indicating who we are. Like chapter 2, you were once dead in trespasses and sins. Now you've been made alive in Christ Jesus. Well, the second half of the book is written in the imperative mood in Greek. So these are commands. These are not suggestions, not pietistic suggestions. These are commands. And among the commands is, fathers, do not exasperate your children, rather rear them in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, paideia and nouthesia of the Lord, which is a command. And understanding that paideia means a whole training of the mind and the morals, not one or the other, but both. We recognize that that's what the Lord was requiring of us. And so one of the major passions of my wife's life is apologetics, and especially training children in apologetics. We talk all the time to our children and to others that when you're born again, there's no such thing as you being indwelled by a junior Holy Spirit if you're a child. And so the same thing that we as adults need to remain faithful to the Lord, the same things our children need. They may need a different communication mechanism, but the substance is the same. And so that being the passion of our hearts and a necessary ingredient of our discipling our children and grounding them, that is how we've started. And by God's grace, it's been a phenomenal journey. As you know, my oldest is 12, soon to be 13 now, Christian. And one of the things we found is that our children have cultivated a voracious appetite for learning, but they view learning as an outgrowth of their commitment to Christ. 1 Peter 2, if these qualities be yours and they're increasing, they'll protect you from being barren and unproductive in your knowledge of the Lord Jesus Christ. Among those, you have fruit of the Spirit, but you also have the acquisition of knowledge. And so he'll tell you, the reason why I love to learn is learning various details. I get invited to another aspect of the mind of God, and it's been such a thrilling journey. It undergirds really my passion, my excitement from being able to join the HSLDA board, because I think it's something that everybody should have the opportunity to pursue. And especially if you're a Christian family, to see that opportunity to take full advantage of it with the freedoms that we enjoy in our country.
Yeah. So COVID changed a lot of things. Lots more people are attracted to homeschooling. How do you see the world post-COVID and the changes in the education world?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that COVID did was to give contemporary parents a front row seat to what their children were and were not receiving. And it's sad to say many parents were simply just not aware. Not aware. My wife and I talk often about, Satan doesn't only build prisons of neglect and lack and poverty. Sometimes in our cultural paradigm, it's easy to think that lack is synonymous with some kind of attack or some kind of demonic activity. But, Satan also builds prisons of luxury. prisons of ease and abundance. And he has no problem with people going to places that they call churches, but his problem arises when we become the church. And so there are lots of people, because of lifestyles and things that are happening, they may not have been able to be as involved in the children's education. In some instances, we're just otherwise engaged. But when you come face to face with your child is learning a math problem, but somehow in the math problem, 2 moms and 2 dads pops up, and parents are like, wait, what's going on there? And seeing a consistent presentation of the fact that there's no such thing as neutral. There's no neutrality. And being confronted with that reality has resulted in many people committing to homeschool. And I think one of the blessings that came out of the challenges and the difficulties that COVID presented was the fact that parents realized, I think I can do a better job. Some are really approaching it from a negative perspective in terms of, well, I want to protect my child from this, as opposed to the affirmative pursuit of something. But regardless of the impetus for the approach, I think one of the things that has happened is that parents have seen what the public education system has presented, and they realize, I don't want my child to go that route. And then others realize, because they were forced to because of COVID, I think I can do it. That was one of the major hurdles that many people had, that they didn't believe they could do anything about it. But now, hadn't been forced to do so during COVID, they now realize, no, I can teach my own child.
So one of the things that I think I've observed is that some of the people who maybe chose homeschooling for the negative reasons, once they get into it, they're drawn to the positive reasons, and they understand the real joy that it can be to be able to work with your own kids. And it feels to me like there's a movement in the country, maybe, that people are choosing to build instead of kind of tear down.
Yeah.
And that homeschooling, and especially homeschooling amongst Christians, can be a real contributor to kind of the health of our society. You have any thoughts about that?
I certainly do. I mean, we will never, as a society, out politic, out elect, even out church deficiencies that are prevalent in the home. As our homes go, as our families go, so go our society. Psalm 128 is a great picture of that. It is the transformed individual that becomes a member of a transformed family. The transformed family becomes an integral component of a transformed church, transformed society. So I believe that our nation will be benefited as a result of parents turning their attention to their homes. That's our first work. That's our first commitment, our first investment. And so as a result of attending to that garden, if you will, that you provide a firmer foundation for society en masse.
So homeschooling has a lot of networks, and, we call them co-ops and support groups, and state leaders and state groups. How do you see the kind of the inner working in your life, and maybe in a bigger way, of all of this kind of organic network of homeschoolers and homeschooling in your community and around the country?
Yeah, having that network and the various networks, I would say, with the firm foundation, it provides an opportunity to be a stopgap against the prevalence of the darkness in the world. I say it on my program, you heard my show, and I never intended for this to become like a catchphrase or anything, but I just made it as a statement of analysis at one point. Darkness is not an affirmative force. It merely reoccupies the space that is vacated by the light, and darkness is not in and of itself potent, but it has a great marketing team. Its apparent ubiquity often presents the notion that, well, it's everywhere, it's inescapable, it's inevitable. But the ubiquitous appearance is not the same as its inevitability in terms of the prevalence of its impact on an individual. And so when you have these networks, like I did growing up as a kid in public school in New Orleans, growing up in the inner city in the hood in New Orleans, I had no concept or framework for homeschooling or homeschooling networks. But as the Lord does, he plucks one out. The Lord opened my eyes to see, and now my children have an entirely different outlook concerning their future. They're not looking at it as if, woes me or anything like that. And in addition to that, you have Acts 17, where the scriptures instruct very plainly that the Lord has determined before time the boundaries of our habitation and the times in which we would live. And then tells us why, so that men should seek God. And so I see this cross-pollination of all of these networks as God establishing a foundation from which he would have his remnant in our nation, just as he's doing all around the world in different contexts around the world and different environments around the world, as a foundation in our nation from which to establish and expand the ranks of the remnant in our country.
You mentioned growing up in New Orleans. What was it like for you growing up, and what was your family life in New Orleans?
Growing up in New Orleans was tough. It was tough. A lot of the things other people experience, I've described it as a modern day Babylon in many ways. A lot of the things that I learned growing up, people would say they experienced in college and things of that nature. I knew there were 8th and 9th graders, 7th graders that were living and doing some of the same things, as I mentioned, I grew up in the inner city. Unfortunately, I had a lot of fights and things of that nature. I remember vaguely some of the first fights I had. One was because I actually had the audacity to have a backpack at school, because I didn't know at my public school, a new public school I'd gone to, they didn't have books. The lessons were taught from photocopies from the books that you did not take textbooks home, and there were lockers in the school, but they were wired shut because, and this is like elementary, middle school, because there's a prevalence of drugs and drug dealing at the schools. So I remember in elementary schools having drug sniffing dogs come to the campus. I remember that. And the second fight I had, I never forget, because one student led to another saying, this dude talks like a white boy. That's what was said to me. And so it was challenging, but I was blessed in this regard. My parents became Christians the year I was born. So I had the wonderful privilege of growing up with parents who were endeavoring to serve the Lord. And so though my parents didn't have a full understanding of their role in discipling me as a child, they were intentional about putting me in a position where I could hear the gospel. And so the gospel proclaimed and being regenerated changed everything about my trajectory. It was, I knew where I was. I was cognizant of the environment I was where I grew up, but I knew that there was something greater first from the eternal standpoint. And in light of the eternal realities, the fact of my eternal hope, having been regenerated as a little boy, changed the way I did life. And I understood that God had a particular purpose for me and sought to glorify himself through my life, even as a child. So I was blessed, though I was in a chaotic environment. Naturally, the Lord gave me the wherewithal, to consider the reality I was seated together with Christ Jesus in heavenly places. And so that really, really shaped my adolescence and put me on a trajectory to be where I am now.
So point guard?
Yes.
You just impressed me as probably a point guard. Like you know where the ball's got to go.
Yeah, I played point all the way through college. That was my position. Yeah. Point guard. Yep.
So how did you get into the? I mean, how did your basketball talent first come to notice so you could get a scholarship at the high school and so forth?
Man, I didn't know much about talent and competition, all of that kind of stuff. What I realized is my dad got a kick out of me playing sports, and so what started off, it was just something that for my dad and I to do together. And then as things progressed, my dad said, "Man, you're pretty good." Mm-hmm. and I had a recruiter come to a Little League playground game for high school. Like New Orleans is weird that you do have people that recruit for high school. And so I ended up going to a high school that was competitive athletically. And it was a frequent occurrence at my high school to have colleges from all over the country to come to our practices. And so that put me on a trajectory to where I ultimately was able to play basketball in college.
Mm. Where did you go to undergraduate?
Oral Roberts University is where I ultimately
Oklahoma?
In Oklahoma, in Tulsa, Oklahoma. That's
and right. Then back to Loyola in New Orleans.
That's right, for law school. And actually, my coach was Scott Sutton, the son of Oklahoma State legendary coach Eddie Sutton. And he actually wrote a letter of recommendation for me to go to law school. So,
oh, nice. Well, what led you to law school?
What led me to law school was one of the major developmental points of my life. My pastor in New Orleans realized that a lot of the wickedness that was prevalent in our nation, well, in that time, and prevalent in our state, was actually being passed legislatively at the state capitol in Baton Rouge. And so I'll never forget this. I was 17 when my pastor made the decision to have our elders to travel back and forth to the state capitol, which was about an hour away, an hour one way, an hour back. So a 2-hour round trip. And so that they could rest on the drive, I had a license, and everybody in New Orleans calls me Lil Abe. So I'm the third, so I'm Lil Abe. He said, we'll have Lil Abe drive us, so I was the driver. And when we went, I'll never forget the first time I went, the state legislature in Louisiana had 144 state representatives and 39 state senators. And I was thinking that I'm going to this, this austere governmental body where these learned scholars who are debating the affairs that will govern our state. And I walk in and I find these grown folks shooting spitballs and voting each other's machines with these long sticks. And I'm looking up on the board that shows the tally of the votes. And I know there's supposed to be 144 representatives, but I look on the floor, I see only about maybe 70, 75. And they're voting each other's machines. And I remember thinking, what kind of chaos is this? And that is where the thought that became darkness is not an affirmative force came from, because here, most people back home have no idea that this is what's happening in the state capitol. And the first question is, why don't they know? But secondarily, why would we allow people who would have such a low regard for the office to conduct these affairs? And so through a series of events, I began to think, although not immediately committing to go to law school at that juncture, I began to think that I could do what they do. This is not what I expected. These are just regular people, and many of them are not very good at what they're doing. And so that put me on the course, learning about legislation a bit. And over time, the Lord turned my heart towards law school after that. So that's how it happened.
So I learned earlier today, once again, for like the 10,752nd time, that we indeed live in a very small world. And your small world in Louisiana, you crossed paths with someone who's in the news much these days, and it also corresponds to your to the Louisiana State Legislature.
Yeah,
somebody that is getting talked about a lot these days.
Yes, by God's grace, I'm a personal friend, and he has been a mentor to me throughout my life with the now Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson. But when I met Speaker Johnson, he was not Speaker Johnson. He was just Mike, and he wasn't an elected official at any capacity. Through my travels back and forth to the state legislature in Baton Rouge at that time, which is interesting because a state representative there was Tony Perkins, who is now president of Family Research Council, and who's also another friend and mentor, Gene Mills. He's the president of the Louisiana Family Forum. But during the course of meeting those men and doing different things with them, when Congressman Johnson, now Speaker Johnson, learned that I was in law school, he had, after we'd met, become an allied attorney with Alliance Defending Freedom. And unbeknownst to me, he recommended me to the Blackstone Fellowship.
What is the Blackstone Fellowship?
The Blackstone Fellowship is a program that was created by the Alliance Defending Freedom with the express purposes of saturating the American legal sphere with Christian attorneys who adhere to a biblical worldview and the William Blackstone orthodoxy concerning constitutionality. It is originalist interpretation, constitutional strict construction, but more than strict construction, adherence to the original intent of the founders in crafting the Constitution. Because contrary to what most people believe in most law schools, I know you know this to be true, that you don't actually study the Constitution in law school. You actually study case law, which was a glaring departure from the Blackstonian orthodoxy concerning constitutionality. And so, unbeknownst to me, Mike Johnson recommended me for that. I had no idea what it was. I didn't know what ADF was. I didn't know it existed. And his recommendation to ADF and to Blackstone of me for that program aided me in my development in constitutional orthodoxy and originally adhering to an originalist interpretation of the U.S. Constitution. So never did we either imagine that I would be, in the place where I am currently, and he would be currently the Speaker of the House of Representatives. 3 people, the third in line for the U.S. presidency. He'll tell you more than anybody else. He's just as shocked, if not more shocked, than anybody else.
I'm not sure it was on his radar screen 5 or 6 weeks ago.
I can tell you for a fact it was not. It was not on his radar. But again, here we are, and there he is. Yeah.
Well, so we've invited you out here to spend a couple of days getting familiar with our work here and getting to meet the staff and learn a little bit more about HSLDA and for us to get to know you a little better. Any impressions?
Yeah, it is. I'd known about HSLDA, but I didn't know all of the intricacies and some of the things that you do. One of the things that is just a great blessing that I wasn't aware of was a compassion program, and it's something that's absolutely necessary. It alleviates and eliminates one of the hurdles, even the financial burden to families who may even be convicted to homeschool and wanting to homeschool, but may not know the next immediate step, or if they know it, do they have the resources to apply to that step? So that is a program that really resonated deeply with me.
You may not know this, maybe you do, but so we're saying hello to you on the board, and Rogers Hellman just left the board to go pursue. He's kind of a genius with medical software, and he's got a heart of a missionary. So he's kind of combining his medical software and his missionary heart, and helping all over the world in places where clinics can't get the right information and all that stuff, and that just has taken off. And so he left the board behind. But many years ago, before he was on our board, he helped us start he came to us and said, we need to help widows, and we need to help people who would homeschool but for the lack of resources. And so he started out with a really generous donation that started our small little, what we now call the Compassion Program. And from the beginning till now, we've given over $15 million to homeschool families who just need a little extra help, primarily in the ability to purchase curriculum for their families. And our team, you met them. They do a wonderful job. One of the things they do is we have a lot of vendors, curriculum companies that join with us, and so when a family needs a grant to get curriculum, the curriculum providers will often provide us the curriculum at cost, so that donor money that comes into our compassion fund goes all the much farther. And it's just a huge blessing to us to kind of partner with the Lord to be able to help families that way. So I'm really pleased that you got to spend some time with them, and the vision that they have over there in the compassion department is really kind of the heartbeat. The legal team is kind of the, it's sort of the heartbeat too, but we like to think that we're tough. And those guys in the compassion program provide the gentle word of compassion that helps people continue. Any other impressions?
Yeah, just the scope of the impact nationally and even internationally, having met Kevin and the international engagement for homeschooling, is just it truly is, and this is an overused word in our culture, but it truly is awesome what God has done and is doing through HSLDA, the several thousands of families that are supported, and seeing the impact and the enduring nature of that impact and in the homeschool community. It's a blessing to be a part of.
Well, we're enormously blessed to have you join us, and you don't have to spend much time with you to see that you have a big heart and a lot of energy and compassion, and your radio program and just the way you talk is just infused with the gospel. So it's a great joy. And I did get to spend a little time with your wife Maria and your son Christian, and they are delightful too. And Maria has, I think, a future. she's pretty awesome.
I think so.
Yeah.
I may be biased, but.
Well, I didn't get to spend as much time with her as you do, but I could tell immediately what attracted you. She's got just a very, very, I can understand the attraction to apologetics, because she's just on fire for not just homeschooling, but homeschooling apologetics and those sort of things too. So I'm going to let you have the last word. Anything you'd like to say, or anything I skipped that you think we should talk about?
I don't know if there's anything you skipped. I'd love to encourage people who may be listening, may be watching this, especially those who may be on the edge of whether or not they are willing to jump into the uncertain waters of homeschooling. If the Lord is leading you in that direction, He will sustain you. It could appear uncertain or turbulent, unplugging from the proverbial matrix, but you will never regret trusting the Lord fully. You'll never regret trusting the Lord fully. And if the Lord is impressing upon you to consider that, I just want to encourage you to trust Him give your life to him, not just in a salvific sense, for eternal salvation, but to trust him in time and to think that we have a God that we can trust with our eternities. If he is worthy of us to place our full unflinching confidence in for eternity, why wouldn't we do so for time too? So I'd encourage you to do that. If you're considering that, if the Lord is trustworthy in the eternal sense as well as the temporal sense, and you'll never regret fully surrendering to his call in your life.
Yeah, I tell people all the time that, you shouldn't just jump into homeschooling lightly, but if the Lord's calling you to this adventure that we are experiencing, and our producing team around us are all homeschooled graduates.
Hey, I didn't know that.
Nobody here can see them, but
I can.
And yeah. And, in many, many ways, but especially in this area of a major life decision to homeschool your kids, if the Lord's calling you, he'll equip you. And
amen.
And in today's world,
and resources.
That's right. In today's world, resources have never been so abundant, and the network is so vibrant, and you don't have to go very far to find somebody that's been there and can help you succeed as well. And I'm sure that, the folks in your community have looked up to you and Maria, and I know you guys are leading or involved in a co-op, and there's just so much of that all over the country today that didn't exist when Homeschool Legal Defense started in 1983. The world has changed a lot, and it's a marvelous choice for any family, and especially if you're interested in raising your kids to follow the Lord. So,
and a lot of those changes I know are due to the work of HSLDA. So thank you for being on the front lines, being on the wall for all of these years to help to contribute to creating a legal environment, as well as, I would say, a cultural environment to where these types of networks can flourish. Yeah.
It's been amazing for me to work here for these last 22 years, following in the footsteps of Mike Ferris and Mike Smith, who had the vision, had the dream, and really, worked hard in the early days when the conclusion was really not known. Homeschooling was either illegal, incorrectly thought to be illegal, or disfavored in every other state. So they had the vision and the courage to kind of duke it out in those early years to where today, it's unquestionably legal. Anybody who has the desire and the commitment can enter homeschooling in any of the 50 states and now even around the world. So it's a real blessing. I will say, though, that, in today's world, and this well now in your position at AFA and now on the board, we have to remain vigilant. We have to continue to work. And we have a new kind of opportunity today, really, to reach more and more people in this environment of liberty. So thank you, Abraham. Again, my guest, Abraham Hamilton, who is the general counsel at American Family Association in Tupelo, Mississippi. That's right. And he journeyed far from the Memphis airport through a long travail, which I heard about earlier. So we were really grateful that he came. And I, once again, am Jim Mason, president of Homeschool Legal Defense Association. And we'd like you, if you've enjoyed this episode, to please share this with your friends. And if you'd like to receive upcoming podcast episodes delivered right to your inbox, you can sign up for the Homeschool Talks email list. Subscribers will also receive exclusive content and will be able to submit questions to address on future podcasts. So make sure to subscribe and submit a question. And if you're not yet a member of HSLDA, you should, like Abraham Hamilton, take out a lifetime membership before you even have children, because you're so committed to the cause of homeschooling. And if you actually are homeschooling and have kids, you can join too. And you don't have to take a lifetime membership. We have all kinds of memberships that can meet your needs. So please go to homeschooltalks.com/join if you're interested in supporting other families like Abraham mentioned. Being a part of Homeschool Legal Defense Association is not just to help you and your family, but to help other families all over the country and the world. And if you would like to consider donating to our Freedom Fund, you can do that also at homeschooltalks.com/donate. So thanks again for listening.
Every week, HSLDA hears from hundreds of homeschool families, many of whom are facing hostility from school officials or discrimination from colleges and employers. We've helped single parents facing criminal charges for homeschooling their children, families traumatized by wrongful CPS investigations, and even a grandmother harassed by the state for homeschooling her granddaughter. By donating to HSLDA, you can help make homeschooling possible for families like these and enable our work to preserve freedom for future generations. Give today at hslda.org/donate. That's hslda.org/donate. Thanks for listening to this episode of Homeschool Talks. If you've enjoyed this conversation, will you do us a favor by sharing it with a friend or leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts? As a reminder, you can find show notes for this episode along with our other Homeschool Talks conversations at hslda.org/podcast. And if you want to be the first to know about new episodes, as well as upcoming guests and topics, you can sign up for our email list using the link in the show notes. That's all for now. We hope you enjoyed this program, and we'll see you next time.